Well, good morning, and hi, Neva. Welcome to Sunday School. Good morning, Pastor Gary. Back there closing the door for me. Thank you very much. We are in Joshua chapter 3 this morning. We've got handouts coming around momentarily. Chapter 3 is a really fun chapter. I won't be able to do this every time, but chapter 1, we had Joshua's commission. Chapter 2, we had the spies that went and checked out the land, well, specifically Jericho. And chapter 3 now, the Israelites are going to cross the Jordan River and enter the Promised Land. And God is interested in making a big deal out of this. He wants to do, I don't know what you think about crossing a river. The Weeping Water Creek is the closest thing we've got here. I'm kind of familiar with the Nishnabotna over in Iowa, which isn't too far off of the size of the Jordan River. Crossing a river, big deal, right? I mean, how exciting can it get? Well, God is going to make it exciting and impressive and scare the pants off of the Canaanites as he does it. So this is a fun little section here. Chapters 3 and 4 actually go together because chapter 3 covers their crossing. Chapter 4 will cover memorializing that crossing, which also tells you it's a big event. They spend a whole chapter committing this thing to memory, setting up stones as a way to remember, and so it's a magnificent event. We don't find out the time of year until chapter 4, but I wanted to give that to you ahead of time. This chart around the outside has months in our calendar, January, February, March. And then inside of that are the month numbers for the Jewish calendar. Then the light green are different activities of the year. And then even further inside of that, we have the month names of the Hebrew calendar. And chapter 4 will tell us that this event occurred, the actual crossing occurred on the 10th day of the first month. The first month is Nisan, and you can see that about at the top. The 14th of Nisan is Passover. So this occurred just a little bit before Passover. Our calendar does everything it can to stay exact with the solar calendar. So every month is the same from year to year. In the Hebrew calendar, every month was 30 days, and every few years they had to add an extra month to get it back on track. So the actual time of their month in comparison to ours varied somewhat. So we're talking late March, early April for this event. That was a long explanation to tell you it's late March, early April. But there's a reason why there's some uncertainty there. We can't nail it down to a specific day in our calendar, and that's why. So this is in the springtime, and you know what happens in the springtime? Yep, it floods. And that's exactly what happens here as well. Let's see. So, Joshua chapter 3. Oh, by the way, if you look at that, I hope it's big enough on your handout to read. Can you tell one of the things that characterizes that first month of Nisan? Yeah, gathering flax. Does flax ring a bell from the previous chapter? Rahab hid the spies under flax. Yeah. We are moving into barley harvest as well. And that's going to become significant in the next chapter because the Israelites will actually gather and eat grain once they get across. So it's the beginning of barley harvest. Okay. Chapter 3. The first couple of verses here have to do with their move from their campground, and the local site was Abel Shittim, and they're going to move down to the river. Then Joshua arose early in the morning, and he and all the sons of Israel set out from Shittim and came to the Jordan, and they lodged there before they crossed. And it came about at the end of 3 days that the officers went through the midst of the camp. I'm going to assume here that the 3 days, by Hebrew reckoning, is a full day and not necessarily more than part of the preceding and following days. So if we were counting it by hours, it may not be, a day and a half. A full day, evening and morning of the next day is probably what that refers to. That would be typical of the Hebrew way of reckoning. And this map, you can see a little yellow arrow that goes from Abel Shittim down to the Jordan River. That's a distance of about 6 miles. So that's the distance they traveled approximately from their campground down to where they camped at the Jordan River. This is an aerial photograph looking from, the airplane is almost over Jericho, and then looking eastward across the Jordan River and across the plain. So you can see approximately where they traveled. 6 miles there is not terribly difficult. Tom Shudak will run that in like 30 minutes or something. Something like that. Okay, but of course they're hauling their tents and bringing along animals and all of their baggage and a large group of people. We don't know exactly how many, but the entire nation. Chapter 3, verse 4. We get continued instruction here on how to travel. However, I skipped verse 3. Sorry about that. Joshua 3 and verse 3. They commanded the people, saying, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, with the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it." So the ark is leading them. They're not just following Joshua or whatever. The ark goes first. Verse 4, "However, there shall be a distance between it and you of about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you shall go, for you have not passed this way before." Okay, so first off, get to the area I want here. 2,000 cubits. How long is a cubit? About 18 inches, foot and a half. How far is 2,000 cubits? Half mile, 3,000 feet? Yeah, 3,000 feet would be 1,000 yards. Sorry, I didn't tell you I was looking for yardage. How far is 1,000 yards? 10 football fields, a half a nautical mile. If you're a long-range shooter, you may be pretty familiar with that 1,000-yard mark. You have to kind of be a little over the edge on your long-range stuff. I struggle a little bit to picture it, so I did you a map here. This is satellite view, thank you Google Earth, of the church. Can you see it there? Church is right up here. If you go from our south driveway to the road into Manley, it's 980 yards. So real close. So when you pull out, if you go that direction, you can see. Exactly. Yeah, you could hardly see the thing. If you go to the south, from our front door down to that big old blue water tower, that's a little over 1,000 yards, 1,030. I was tempted to, let's take a field trip and go look out the door, but you can do that. You can do that later on your own. The water tower is pretty visible from here, but if you imagine a handful of guys carrying an ark down at the foot of it, you're like, yeah, that's a ways. That's across the valley. So the Israelites were not to follow right on the heels of the ark. They were to be a ways back. Any thoughts as to why that might have been?
Well, you couldn't touch it, the one guy carrying.
Okay, definitely don't touch it.
Somewhere between 1,000 yards and
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
the word about scares me.
Okay. About 1,000 yards? Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, unless you had a string or something, it would be real hard to be exact about it, but... Uh-huh. Yeah, in fact, most people probably couldn't see it at all. Yeah, how would you know if it's moving? Well, fortunately, the plain here is pretty flat, unless they dip down in an REO down into a dry riverbed or something for a bit. But get your binoculars out and mm-hmm. Yeah. And the text doesn't say. My understanding is that normally when the ark moved, it was covered. Now, most of the drawings you'll see of this don't have it covered. A few of them do. Yeah, I think too. I keep back. Don't get too too close, too familiar. It certainly prevents like a rush or a crush of people. You know, when you've got that many folks moving, how do you slow down? Well, you can't quickly. And so that provides some leeway, practically speaking. I think, too, part of it's just, yeah, this is God. He's leading us. Don't get too close. And then, of course, what the text actually says is you haven't been this way before. You don't know where you're going, so keep your distance. So you can kind of watch ahead of time. You don't, somehow run ahead or something like that. That's a good point. It doesn't need protection. Yeah, that's a good point too. I like that. Okay. Verse 5, then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And that's all we get. Consecrate, it's related to the word we use for holy. Make yourselves holy, set apart, something like that. And we're kind of left to guesswork as to what that meant. Certainly, if you've been sinning, stop. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. You shouldn't be doing that anyway. Surely, if you've got any false worship, idols, other religious things around you, clean those out. We know the Israelites had trouble with that for preceding generations and succeeding generations too. But the text doesn't say a whole lot more than that. Verse 7, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. You shall, moreover, command the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Interesting statement from a couple perspectives. We don't find out until late in the chapter, verse 15, that the Jordan River is in flood stage. It's overflowing its banks. Now, in some ways, that makes the job of the priests a little easier here, because when it's over the banks, it's going to be shallow on the outer edges. They just have to walk up. There's not like a steep bank and you're sliding in. They just have to walk up to that edge and put their feet in the water. The folks in this picture are pilgrims coming to the Jordan River to be baptized. And the river looks pretty full there as well, probably in the spring again, Epiphany. The other thing that interests me here is the fact that God wants them to actually put their feet into the water. I kind of take that as both a sign and a step of faith. You don't stand at a safe distance and watch this miracle, but get up there and put your feet in the water. Maybe I'm seeing more than was what actually in the text there, but they come up and they actually get their feet wet. In chapter 3 and 15, we'll read that the Jordan is in flood stage. We will also read that in chapter 4 and verse 18. This is significant for a couple of reasons. I want to get ahead of myself here, but okay, I'll wait on that just a second. There's the riverbed, and then there's the flood plain, and then there's low hills, and then eventually you get high hills. That flood plain gets flooded every year, it used to, until they dammed stuff up and siphoned off a bunch of water. That floodplain's about a half mile wide, and so it's quite conceivable that the river at this point is a half mile wide. We've experienced some of that accidentally with the Missouri River in recent years, where you're used to seeing it like this, and now it's huge. Used to be that way a lot before they dredged it. Assuming that it's a half mile across at this point, it's hard to see anything distinctly across that distance. I mean, like people. Are there enemy warriors over there? Those kinds of things. You could have seen across, but so the Canaanites, I'm assuming, would not have been even attempting to defend the river at this point. If it's just a narrow river, I could see where you would have a bunch of Canaanites over there with bows and arrows. We're going to stop these people if we can. But at flood stage, there's no point. I'm not an archer, but from what I understand, with modern technology, you could get a bow, probably get an arrow across a half a mile. It'd be tough. With ancient technology, no way. You never could have gotten an arrow that far. So what's the point? I mean, that's your long range weapon. No, the entire thing. I'll show you a picture here after a moment when we get to those verses, but well, you can probably see this too. This looks to me like a clear mountain stream in this painting. And what it would have been is like what we see with the Weeping Water Creek, a muddy torrent. Just, kind of nasty, dirty brown. Put your feet in it, he tells them. The fact that it's in flood stage is also going to make this miracle magnificent. Just really outstanding. Okay, so let me read, starting with verse 9. I'll go all the way to through 13. Then Joshua came to the sons of Israel, said to the sons of Israel, "Come here and hear the words of Yahweh your God." And Joshua said, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly dispossess from before you the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Hivite, the Perizzite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, and the Jebusite." Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over ahead of you into the Jordan. Now then, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from each tribe. And it shall come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above shall stand up in one heap. So, he tells them what's going to happen. Just a couple quick things along the way. He gives kind of the standard list of people groups within Canaan. We know approximately where some of them live. You can see on this map. Jebusites, of course, that's the city of Jebus or Jerusalem. The Hivites just to the north of them. Canaanites down on the coast, Canaanites in the hill country, Amorites to the south and back in the area they'd come from. Hivites were further up to the north. Some of them we just don't know. Girgashites, Hethites, Perizzites. We just don't know. Hope you're okay with that. If I find out someday, I'll let you know, but I've got access to some people that know quite a bit, and they don't know, so I'll just leave it at that. This is the Jordan River back in the 1960s, across from Jericho. Today, it's not far from the New Testament location of Bethany, where Jesus was, John the Baptist was baptizing. Just to give you, that's probably a little broader than the Weeping Water Creek. So here is the floodplain. We are looking north. Get my pointer out. Right about here is where we would expect them to have crossed. So the Dead Sea is to the south of us. Can you make out the edge of the floodplain where the hills rise up here that obviously don't get flooded, but the rest of this is all flat? There's an edge along here as well. That may be a little hard to see. I've got a series of pictures from the, 30s. American Colony, some folks from the American Colony photographers were down there when the river flooded, and these are all from about the area around Jericho. The river doesn't do this anymore, so all we're stuck with are old photos. But when it flooded, it was a pretty significant event. You can see some wooden buildings that are kind of crushed there. I should have put a date on this. You can see a road dipping down into the flood waters. 35? Okay. That's funny. I was thinking 34, and I was wrong. 1935, thank you. Yeah. So this is essentially what I would expect the Israelites were looking at when they walk up to the river. And God tells them ahead of time, when the feet of the priests touch the water, it's gonna divide somehow, and the water's gonna stop upstream, and you're gonna be able to cross. They're back a half a mile. I would love to know how this happened, or what it looked like, even from a little bit of a distance. I have no idea how God did this. It was clearly miraculous. This is not. I've read people that say, well, there was a landslide up at Adam that the dirt came across and blocked off the river and it drained out. And these guys cross in a day. And to go from flood stage to where it's crossable by natural means, it's not going to happen. It won't drain out and dry that quickly. A lot of debris, a lot of mud. Yeah. So I'm not sure how God did this, but it's clearly miraculous. There's nothing natural about this. What kind of soil is it? That's a good question, Daniel. I have seen soil maps before, and I didn't bother to review that for this. So some kind of alluvial deposit, but whether it's clay, I don't think it's sandy. Say it again. Well, I mean, anytime you have a floodplain, there's going to be some sand in it. But whether it's, I don't have a good answer for that. See if I can find something out for you there. This is that same section that we looked at earlier. Last time, the aerial view, we were down here and looking northward. This is where the modern Allenby Bridge goes across. Go one more slide, Kris. So I have colored in here for you the floodplain. So you can see the river itself and then how wide it would be when fully flooded. We know it doesn't get higher than that because these hills are eroded naturally. They're not flood product. But that floodplain is all flat, other than the little. If I go back, can you see the little oxbows in there? So that they've got an orange line because it's an international border. But you see all these little oxbows? They're just there's tons of them here where you can kind of see them in the trees, and they are down here too. But that tells you that this is very flat and that the river changes course a lot. The Missouri River used to do that all the time too. Carter Lake is an old oxbow that's now cut off from the river. There's not a connection anymore. Fairly similar to what we have here. So measuring across from the narrow points, we're at least a half mile across and a little more than that in other areas. Not until you kind of get up to the edge. So if you're coming from the east here, you'd have to kind of get in this area before you could actually see down into here. You probably could have seen some water from a little ways back, but this all is pretty flat. You can see how it's eroded from the very rare rains that they get there. But nothing, it's so dry, nothing grows. It's just dirt. So are those 30, 40, 50 feet above the floodplain? It's not much. Not significant hills like what you see behind Jericho. Did you pick up just briefly that he appointed 12 men, one from each tribe, and he didn't say anything about what they were supposed to do? We don't find out until the next chapter. But it's here that he appoints them. They're going to be assigned actually to pick up rocks for a memorial. But here he just says appoint them, so you've got them ready. Another. Not in this area. It's too dry. The hill country would have been much more forested than what we see today. But down here, the only thing that grows is right along the riverbed and an oasis like Jericho where there's water. But the rest of this is just bone dry. So it still is. I have never seen any evidence that it was any different here. It's because of the geology. There's the hill country, and just like out west in California, the mountains push the air up as it comes over, and it has to drop its water. And then when it tops that rise and comes back down on the other side, it's just bone dry there. Those desert areas, because the clouds have lost their moisture, and the exact same thing happens here. It goes across, and then the air comes back up over the Jordanian plateau and can again drop some water. But it's deforested not because anybody's cut it, but there's just not enough rainfall except in a very rare year, but it's not enough to support a tree long term, except for a bush or something a goat would eat. I grew up with goats, and they'll eat anything. Okay. Verse 14. I think I'm ready for that. Am I not? Oh, since I put this up there. From this angle, you can tell a little more where the edge of the floodplain is. It stands out a little more. You can see along here. Some places the river comes right up next to it. Again, I've colored in an area for you so you can see about where the floodplain is at. And presumably in flood stage, a good portion and perhaps all of this is covered with water. And so that's what these guys are looking at. What a miracle. Okay, verse 14. So it came about when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and when those who carried the Ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest, that the waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in one heap, a great distance away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those which were flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho. You're going to wonder, well, you have it on your map. You can see Adam here, up the Jordan River, north of the crossing place. How far is it from Adam to the Dead Sea? Because that whole strip of the river is bone dry now. How far is it? 10? 20? Yeah. That's pretty close. It's actually 23. 23 miles dried up? That's a little hard to get our mind around. So I did you another map. Okay, the names on here are a little small. This is the Missouri River. This is Weeping Water. Here's Manly. There's the church. Here's Murdoch. So this is roughly the course of the Weeping Water Creek. Let's see, at Union it turns and comes down here. From the mouth of the Weeping Water to Murdoch is real close to 23 miles. So hopefully you all know enough places on there that you can kind of get a feel for how far this is. This is a long distance. God took this river in flood stage, dried it up, 23 miles. Now, you might get a nation across there. Yeah. So, here I got a picture for you of Adam. It's just a little bitty mound, and Zarethan is not too far to the north of it up there. So somewhere in this region, God put his hand down and stopped the waters and let them pile up. I don't know if he put his hand down physically, but this is way, way, way out of sight for the Israelites. They couldn't see that. How would they know that it had happened or where it happened? But it's out of sight. I mean, it would have to be, I don't know, 1,000 feet. How far? So it's like 16 miles from where they're at. I guess you could see a radio tower at that distance if it had lights on it at night. Well, I'm assuming that they heard about this later on or figured it out later on from the locals. You guys won't believe what happened. Right here at Adam, the Jordan stopped and piled up. And then God just dried the whole thing up. I don't know if there's a big puff of steam or if he just, suddenly it's dry. And he also dried it to the south of them, down to the Dead Sea. So on this map, we're crossing roughly in this area, so 6 or 7 miles down to the Dead Sea. If you're ever on Google Earth, anything you mouse over, it'll tell you your elevation. So I moused over the Dead Sea. It's at minus 1363. It's below sea level by 1,300 feet. It's probably closer to 1,300 feet even at that time. The floodplain at Jericho is minus 1,250. So over that 6 miles, it's about a 50-foot drop. I thought, wow, that's flat. But then I did the same thing from the mouth of the Weeping Water Creek up to Nahaka, which is about the same distance, and it's about the same elevation difference. So, can you imagine if you dammed it up at Nahaka, how long would it take to drain? You know, it'd start fairly early, right where you dammed it up. For the whole thing to dry out, well, for the whole 23 miles to dry out, I just don't see any way that happens just by letting the water run out in time for everybody to cross in a day. So again, it seems to me like just a magnificent miracle on God's part. So when the Israelites go to cross, there is no water in sight. The riverbed's dry, the banks are dry. Well, it's 16 miles away. So, yeah, it's not the Red Sea where we've got this channel and we're looking up at the fish. And now, of course, you go Google crossing the Jordan, pretty much every painting you'll see has a wall of water right next to the ark. It's like, somebody forgot to read the narrative here before they painted their picture. Yeah. I'm just impressed with the scope of the miracle that God worked here. And I'm convinced he did it that way, specifically that way, on purpose. He wanted a magnificent entry into the land, and this is how he did it. Time it, make them sit there and wait till it's flooded, and then say, okay, walk up to the river, and their feet touch the water, and he dries up 23 miles of flooded river. And says, okay, now you can walk across. Yeah.
Major zero flow, which means there's no flow. You see streams that just are rivers that just water just sitting there because there's no flow because it's dammed up in a little spot. So it wouldn't be a completely dry riverbed on a natural case.
Yeah.
There'd always be
Yeah.
some water standing there if I stopped the flow of any stream.
Yeah.
These little lakes all the way down.
Yeah. Perhaps for months.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the point that he points out is dry bed is I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have a couple references in here to the dryness of the bed.
That he dried up such a large area, not only would Jericho have noticed, but it would have announced to a very large population that
Yeah. Yeah. Which is exactly the message that they took away from it too. 17. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground, until all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. That's just amazing. Wouldn't surprise me if they fanned out and took. You would still have banks on the riverbed itself, and crossing places that were easier, fords that were easier, less of a bank, and so it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Israelites kind of fanned out and took a number of different crossing spots. Some places are easier than others, but they all crossed in that day. Yeah, the priests were first in and last out. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if they're keeping that distance even as they cross. Yeah, that's true. It doesn't tell us how many carried it. I think 4 guys could easily do it. It becomes more awkward when you have more than that. So that would be my guess. But there's no indication in the text. We have the union dictated it had to be at least 6. Could have been other priests with it. We'll discover in the next chapter that these 12 guys appointed set up stones there, set up stones up on the back. So apparently they were in that area. But exactly what it looked like, I would love to know, and I don't know. It's a great question. Okay, so what's the meaning of this chapter? What's the purpose of this? So I've kind of stated it several times already, hoping you'd catch it, but God's bringing His people into the promised land, and He's not doing it in a mundane way. This is a magnificent way to do this. It tells His people, look who's on your side. Look who's leading you. He wants you to be obedient, to follow His directives, and be faithful to Him, but look who's on your side. It says to the Canaanites, some of you have said this already, uh-oh. He's not on our side. I honestly believe that this is in some ways a gracious thing on God's part too. Do you remember, and I didn't write down where He said this, but God said at one point, I'll drive them out before you using things like hornets and wasps. In other words, you shouldn't need to massacre everybody. We'll drive them out ahead of you. This should have been a sign to these guys. Whoever these Israelites are serving, their God is more powerful than our gods. He wants this land. If we want to live, we should probably move. Now, most of them didn't. We do have a few folks like the Gibeonites that use guile to stay in the land, and the Israelites just let some of them stay, but it should have been a sign. Yeah, that's a great point. This man Joshua is now replaced, and it's not all about the leader. Ultimately, it's about the God that the leader serves. Moses is my servant. He was known as that. Good. Oh yes, I got you a picture of a dry riverbed. This is one that's actually usually dry during the year, the Wadi Kilt. In the springtime, it'll have water running in it because of the rain up in the hills, but it's normally dry. But I thought kind of a good visual for where the Israelites would have crossed. And I gave you this painting as well on your handout, which is probably one of my favorites for crossing the river. This I just thought was kind of interesting because it's a smattering of examples of your average typical painting where you see this wall of water or something like that right next to the ark. It's like, well, not exactly. It was a far, far way off.
I wonder the volume of water that was stacking up.
Yeah,
If it was in flood stage,
yeah.
still, what volume, how high did it stack?
It had to be significant. Yeah, 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 yeah. It would have been a redoubled flood. Okay, just 2 quick points here. This extraordinary miracle brings the Israelites into the promised land. So this is, entry into the promised land is something they have been anticipating for generations, going all the way back to the promise to Abraham. And so here, this is the record of that event actually taking place. And then it seems to me the Israelites should have been supremely confident in their God. You know, the 12 tribes a generation earlier, 12 spies a generation earlier, 10 of them had said, we can't go take this land. Walled cities, great big people, there's no way. These guys should have had a different perspective on that now. We've had a couple of things up to this point, but this should have removed any doubt. God is giving us this land. He's ahead of us. He's leading us. We just got to be obedient and follow. And He will give it to us. I need to close. Sorry, I'd take more questions, but I'm running late, so let me pray. Lord, thank you for this narrative that we have here. We are impressed with the way that you care for your people. You are willing to do extraordinary things to accomplish your will. We see what you did here for the Israelites, and I just pray that our own faith would be bolstered, that we would not be timid or afraid or lazy, but that you would help us to think about this stuff seriously, realizing that you are the same God that leads us, and that we would have faith in you and would not give up or become despondent because of the things we see going on around us. But we know that our faith, our trust, our hope is in you, and pray that you would strengthen that even through this story. In your name I pray. Amen.